Texas, October 1943. When the cattle trucks rolled through the gates of Camp Hearn, carrying 200 Italian prisoners of war, most expected to find their American captors wielding whips and serving stale bread. Instead, they found Sergeant Bill Mackenzie handing out cold lemonade and apologizing for the dust kicked up by the convoy. Among those stepping down from the trucks was Antonio Rossi, a 26-year-old baker from Naples, clutching a small wooden cross his mother had given him before he shipped out to North Africa. He had prepared himself for cruelty, starvation, maybe even execution. What he hadn't prepared for was kindness, genuine, inexplicable American kindness that would challenge everything he thought he knew about his captors. Before we continue, subscribe and hit that bell. Here we retell the forgotten human stories of war. The October sun blazed overhead as the Italians were led not to cramped cells or concrete bunkers, but to sturdy wooden barracks with real beds, clean sheets, and windows that actually opened to let in the prairie breeze. Antonio's weathered hands trembled as he touched the mattress, the first real bed he'd seen in over 18 months of military service. The camp stretched across former ranch land, surrounded by rolling hills, dotted with ancient oak trees and mesquite bushes. The air carried the scent of barbecue smoke from the mess hall, fresh hay from nearby pastures, and something else Antonio couldn't quite identify at first: the absence of fear. Sergeant Mackenzie, a weathered man from Fort Worth with calloused hands and kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses, had clearly been preparing for this moment. He addressed the new arrivals in broken but earnest Italian he'd been learning from a tattered phrasebook for weeks. "Benvenuti in Texas," he said, with a genuine smile that reached his eyes. "Welcome to Texas. You are prisoners, yes, but you are also men with dignity. We will treat you as such." Several Italians exchanged bewildered glances. This wasn't the America their fascist commanders had described, the land of brutal capitalists who supposedly showed no mercy to captured enemies. As the afternoon wore on, the prisoners were processed not like cattle, but like guests checking into an unusual hotel. They were issued clean uniforms, toiletries that included actual soap and toothbrushes, and even writing materials so they could send letters home. The camp's Italian interpreter, Corporal Michael Romano, no relation to any of the prisoners, despite sharing a surname with several, explained the rules with patience rather than barked commands. Work details would begin Monday, but weekends were for rest. They could attend religious services, participate in recreational activities, and even request books from the camp library. The real shock came at dinner time. Instead of thin gruel or hardtack, the prisoners were served beef stew with actual chunks of tender meat, fresh bread still warm from the camp bakery, mashed potatoes with real butter, green beans seasoned with bacon, and coffee. Genuine coffee, not the chicory substitute they'd grown accustomed to during the war's final, desperate months in North Africa. Antonio took his first bite and felt tears sting his eyes. It had been 8 months since he'd tasted food prepared with care rather than merely calories designed to keep soldiers functional. The mess hall buzzed with confused conversation in rapid Italian as men compared their experiences. "They asked if I had any dietary restrictions," whispered Marco Benedetti, a former mechanic from Rome. "Dietary restrictions, as if I were dining at the Grand Hotel." Others marveled at the American guards who served their food with genuine politeness, asking, "More bread?" and "How's the stew?" as if they were waiters in a restaurant rather than captors guarding enemies. That first night, lying on a real mattress with clean sheets for the first time in over a year, Antonio stared at the ceiling and listened to the gentle sounds of Texas evening filtering through the open windows. Crickets chirped in the mesquite bushes, cattle lowed peacefully in distant pastures, and from the guard posts came the soft murmur of American soldiers playing cards and sharing jokes. No screaming, no gunshots, no sounds of brutality echoing through concrete corridors. Just peace, the kind of peace he'd almost forgotten existed in the world. The next morning brought Antonio's first real shock about American intentions. After a breakfast that would have been considered luxurious in wartime Italy, eggs scrambled with cheese, thick strips of bacon, pancakes with real maple syrup, and coffee so good it reminded him of pre-war Naples, Sergeant Mackenzie approached him with an unusual request. "Rossi, we heard from your intake interview that you were a baker before the war. Our camp baker, Corporal Williams, just got transferred to the Pacific. Would you be interested in helping us feed 2,000 men? It's honest work, pays 80 cents a day, and Lord knows we need someone who understands how to make bread that doesn't bounce when you drop it." Antonio's mouth fell open. They were asking, not commanding. In the Italian army, orders came as shouts and threats. Here, an American sergeant was making a polite request, offering fair wages and even admitting their own shortcomings with humor rather than defensiveness. Within hours, Antonio found himself in the camp's fully equipped bakery, staring at industrial-sized sacks of flour, sugar, and yeast, more baking supplies than he'd seen in 2 years of rationing and shortages. The facility was better equipped than his family's bakery back in Naples, with modern ovens, proper mixing equipment, and unlimited access to ingredients that had become precious commodities in wartime Europe. Corporal Jimmy Watson, a cheerful young man from Dallas, with flour permanently dusting his uniform and under his fingernails, showed him around the facility with obvious pride. "We serve fresh bread every day here," Jimmy explained, his Texas drawl thick as molasses. "Hot rolls for breakfast, sandwich bread for lunch, and usually something special for dinner. Cornbread, biscuits, sometimes even dinner rolls. These boys are far from home, fighting a war they didn't choose. Least we can do is feed them right and treat them like the human beings they are." As Antonio began kneading dough for the first time since leaving Italy, muscle memory taking over as his hands worked the familiar rhythm, other prisoners gathered to watch in amazement. The sight of their fellow captive working alongside American soldiers, treated as a colleague rather than forced labor, challenged their preconceptions about American intentions. Marco Benedetti shook his head in disbelief. "They're letting you touch their food supplies. They trust you not to poison them? Madonna mia, what kind of war is this?" Antonio smiled, feeling something stir in his chest that he'd almost forgotten during long months of military service. Professional pride. "Watch this," he told his fellow prisoners, beginning to shape the dough into traditional Italian forms. "I'm going to show these Texans what real bread looks like." The real surprise came at noon, when a convoy of pickup trucks arrived at the camp gates. These weren't military vehicles, but civilian trucks driven by local ranchers and farmhands from the surrounding Robertson County area. They'd come to hire prisoner work crews, but instead of the forced labor the Italians had expected, they discovered they'd be paid actual wages. 80 cents a day for skilled work like carpentry or mechanical repair, 50 cents for agricultural labor, and 10 cents for basic tasks. More importantly, they'd be working alongside American civilians who treated them as temporary co-workers rather than conquered enemies. Giuseppe Romano, a 34-year-old horse trainer from Sicily whose weathered hands spoke of decades working with animals, found himself assigned to the Henderson Ranch. The sprawling property stretched across thousands of acres of Texas prairie, home to some of the finest quarter horses in the state. His supervisor was Red Murphy, a grizzled cowboy whose sun-beaten face and gentle manner with animals immediately reminded Giuseppe of his own grandfather back in Palermo. "You Italians know horses," Red observed, watching Giuseppe's instinctive approach to a skittish mare that had been giving the ranch hands trouble for weeks. His weathered hands moved with practiced confidence, speaking to the animal in the universal language of patience and respect. "My granddaddy always said you can tell a man's true character by how animals respond to him. This here horse has been nothing but trouble for months, but she's already calming down for you. That tells me everything I need to know about who you really are." As the weeks passed, the work details became less about labor and more about cultural exchange. Italian prisoners taught American farmers techniques for growing vegetables in harsh conditions, shared recipes their families had used for generations, and demonstrated old-world craftsmanship that impressed their hosts. In return, they learned American farming methods, picked up English phrases, and discovered that their former enemies were often just as homesick, just as worried about family members, and just as eager for the war to end as they were. Now, tell us in the comments where you're watching from and what time of day this story found you. It's curious to know how far these human memories reach. 3 weeks into their captivity, the Italian prisoners at Camp Hearn received another unprecedented offer that would fundamentally change their understanding of American intentions. Major Robert Hayes, the camp commander whose quiet dignity had impressed even the most skeptical prisoners, gathered them in the mess hall for what he called an unusual business proposition. The Major, a tall man from Houston whose family had built their fortune in construction, spoke with the measured tone of someone accustomed to commanding respect through competence rather than fear. "Gentlemen," he began, his Texas drawl softened by genuine respect and careful attention to pronunciation of Italian names, "we need to expand this camp to accommodate more prisoners arriving from the Italian campaign. Instead of bringing in outside contractors and spending taxpayer money, we'd like you to build your own quarters. You'll be paid standard construction wages, that's $1.20 a day for skilled carpentry, 80 cents for general construction. And you can design the buildings to your preferences, within reason and security requirements, of course." Antonio felt his knees go weak. They were being asked to literally build their own prison, yet somehow it felt like the opposite of imprisonment. It felt like citizenship, like being trusted members of a community rather than conquered enemies awaiting punishment. Silvio Martinelli, a gifted architect from Florence who'd been drafted into Mussolini's army against his will and conscience, stepped forward eagerly, his eyes lit up with the first genuine excitement he'd felt since being captured at El Alamein. "Signor Maggiore," he said in careful English he'd been practicing with Corporal Romano, "we could create something beautiful. Not just functional buildings, but structures with, comme si dit, with dignity, with pride, buildings that honor both your hospitality and our craftsmanship." Within days, what had started as a practical prison construction project became something resembling an international community development program. The Italians worked alongside American construction supervisors, sharing techniques and learning from each other. They designed barracks with high ceilings and large windows to let in the abundant Texas light, proper ventilation for the intense summer heat, and small personal touches that made institutional housing feel more like temporary homes. Under Silvio's architectural guidance, they built a chapel where prisoners could worship according to their own traditions, complete with hand-carved wooden pews and a small bell tower that could be heard across the camp. They constructed a library where they could read books provided by the American authorities, not just Italian literature, but American classics translated into Italian, technical manuals for learning new skills, and even English-language newspapers to follow the war's progress. The crowning achievement was a small theater for evening entertainment. The prisoners had mentioned their tradition of community performances during religious festivals, and Major Hayes had authorized construction of a proper performance space. Complete with a raised stage, simple lighting, and seating for 300, it became the heart of camp social life. Local townspeople began visiting the camp, not as curious gawkers or hostile observers, but as genuine collaborators in this unprecedented experiment. Mrs. Eleanor Hayes, the Major's wife and a former schoolteacher with a master's degree from the University of Texas, started teaching English classes 3 evenings a week in the new classroom building the prisoners had constructed. Her students included not just Italians, eager to communicate better with their captors, but American guards wanting to learn basic Italian phrases to better connect with the men under their supervision. The sight of former enemies sitting together in classroom desks, struggling through pronunciation exercises and laughing at each other's mistakes, would have been unthinkable just months before. But it became routine at Camp Hearn, where linguistic barriers gradually gave way to genuine communication and mutual respect. The most surprising partnership developed between Giuseppe Romano and Red Murphy. After weeks of working together on the Henderson Ranch, sharing techniques for horse training and discovering their common passion for animals, Red made an unprecedented gesture. He invited Giuseppe to his family's Sunday dinner. "Maria makes the best chicken and dumplings in Robertson County," Red explained, his usual gruff manner softened by genuine affection. "Besides, my wife's been pestering me for weeks to bring you by. Says she wants to learn how to make real Italian bread, and she's heard you're friends with that baker fellow from the camp." That Sunday evening, Giuseppe found himself sitting at a dinner table with Red's family. His wife Maria, their teenage daughter Sarah, Red's elderly father Samuel, and two younger sons who stared at the real Italian soldier with wide-eyed fascination. Initially, the conversation was stilted, with Maria serving food and making polite inquiries about Giuseppe's family back in Sicily, while Samuel, a Spanish-American war veteran, remained suspicious of having an enemy soldier at his table. But when Giuseppe produced a small wooden whistle he'd carved during quiet evening hours at camp and played a haunting Sicilian folk song his grandfather had taught him, the atmosphere transformed completely. The melody spoke of longing for home, of love for family, of hopes for peace, universal themes that transcended nationality and language. Samuel's weathered eyes filled with tears as he listened, and when the song ended, he reached across the table to grasp Giuseppe's hand. "Music," he said simply, his voice thick with emotion. "Music don't know nothing about borders or flags or politics. That their song could have been written by my own daddy, missing his home back in Tennessee." And by December 1943, Camp Hearn had transformed into something that defied easy categorization or military precedent. It was still technically a prisoner of war camp, surrounded by regulation fences and staffed by armed guards, but it felt more like an international community college with very strict residency requirements and an unusually diverse student body. The transformation became most visible in the camp's newest and most unexpected addition, a fully equipped art studio that would become legendary among military historians studying prisoner treatment during World War II. The studio's origins traced back to Private Danny Martinez, a young guard from San Antonio whose artistic aspirations had been interrupted by military service. During his rounds, he'd noticed that several Italian prisoners were sketching portraits of their fellow captives on scraps of paper, using improvised charcoal made from burned wood and creating remarkably detailed artwork despite their limited materials. Instead of confiscating these drawings as potential security risks or contraband, he approached Major Hayes with an innovative idea. "Sir, what if we set up a proper art room?" Danny suggested during a weekly staff meeting. "These men have real talent, I mean professional-level skill, and it might help with morale for everyone. Happy prisoners cause fewer problems, and some of these drawings are so good they could probably sell them to folks in town who'd appreciate real European art." Major Hayes, whose wife had studied art history at the University of Texas, immediately grasped the potential. Within 2 weeks, a converted storage building had been transformed into a fully equipped studio space, complete with easels, canvas, oil paints, watercolors, charcoal, and proper drawing paper purchased with funds from the camp's recreational budget. The art studio became the camp's beating heart, a place where creativity flourished despite the artificial constraints of wartime captivity. Italian prisoners painted landscapes of their homeland from memory, creating works so achingly beautiful that American visitors often asked to purchase them directly from the artists. These weren't tourist trinkets or crude prison artwork. They were sophisticated paintings that captured the essence of Italian countryside with professional skill and emotional depth that spoke to universal experiences of homesickness and longing. Antonio discovered that his talents extended far beyond baking when he began painting murals on the mess hall walls. His depictions of Italian countryside scenes, rolling Tuscan hills dotted with ancient olive trees, stone bridges spanning mountain streams, village markets bursting with colorful produce and animated vendors, transported viewers to a world far removed from Texas heat and military routine. American guards would pause during their rounds to study his work, often asking questions about the places he'd painted and sharing stories of their own hometowns in return. The studio attracted an unlikely but regular visitor who would become central to the camp's most profound transformation, Mrs. Dorothy Jensen, a wealthy rancher's widow from nearby Bryan, whose family had built their fortune in cattle and oil. She'd lost her only son, Lieutenant James Jensen, in the North African campaign, where many of these same Italians had been captured during the fierce fighting around Tunisia. Initially, she'd come to the camp filled with anger and grief, wanting to confront the men she blamed for her son's death, expecting to find monsters who could justify her hatred and provide a target for her overwhelming loss. Instead, she found herself drawn to their art, their evident humanity, their own stories of loss and separation from families they loved. She began visiting the studio weekly, initially standing silent and suspicious in the doorway, then gradually engaging in halting conversations with prisoners who spoke some English or through Corporal Romano's patient translation. "I came here hating you," she told Antonio one afternoon, as she watched him add delicate details to a painting of Naples harbor, complete with fishing boats and seagulls that seemed ready to fly off the canvas. Her voice carried the weight of months of grief, but also growing confusion about the nature of her enemies. "My boy died fighting your army in North Africa. He was only 22, engaged to a sweet girl from Houston, planning to study law after the war. But looking at your paintings, seeing the way you capture that light on the water, the love you put into every brushstroke when you paint your home, I see that you miss your family, just like he missed his. You're not monsters. You're just men who got caught up in something bigger than all of us." The art studio became a bridge between worlds that war had artificially divided. American guards learned to say bello when admiring a painting and picked up Italian color names: rosso, blue, verde. Italian prisoners mastered English art terms and Texas expressions, creating a unique pidgin language of appreciation and creativity. Local school children came on carefully supervised field trips, initially to learn about the enemy as part of their social studies education, but leaving with small drawings gifted by homesick men who missed their own children back in Italy and found comfort in sharing their artistic skills with the next generation. Giuseppe Romano, when not working with horses at the Henderson Ranch, revealed himself to be a gifted sculptor whose hands seemed to understand clay the same way they understood horse behavior. Using clay from a nearby riverbank and tools improvised from camp materials, he created small figurines that captured the essence of both worlds he now inhabited: horses in motion, cowboys at work, Italian farmers tending olive groves, children playing traditional games. His sculptures became treasured gifts that crossed cultural boundaries and created lasting connections. Red Murphy's teenage daughter, Sarah, treasured a small clay horse Giuseppe had made for her, a perfect miniature quarter horse that captured the spirit of her favorite mount. In return, Red had carved Giuseppe a wooden cross that matched the one his mother had given him in Naples, using skills learned from his own grandfather and blessed by the local priest who'd begun visiting the camp to minister to both Italian prisoners and American guards, who found themselves questioning the nature of their enemies. Spring 1944 brought news that would fundamentally alter the dynamics at Camp Hearn, and force both prisoners and guards to confront the temporary nature of their unique community. The war in Italy was turning decisively in favor of the Allies. Mussolini had fallen from power, and the new Italian government under Marshal Badoglio was now actively cooperating with Allied forces. For many prisoners, this meant their legal status was changing. They could volunteer for more extensive work programs, even outside the camp, while awaiting eventual repatriation to a homeland that would be very different from the one they'd left. But something remarkable and unexpected was happening among the prisoners. Many, including Antonio, found themselves deeply conflicted about the prospect of leaving Camp Hearn. They had built lives, friendships, and purposes in this corner of Texas that felt more authentic and meaningful than anything they'd experienced during years of fascist military service or the grinding poverty of Depression-era Italy. Antonio's weekly letters home to his mother had evolved dramatically from desperate pleas for survival to detailed descriptions of a life that seemed almost too good to believe. "Mamma mia," he wrote in his careful script, working by lamplight in the camp library after his baking duties were finished. "I must tell you something that will sound impossible, but I swear on Papa's grave that every word is true. I'm learning that America is not what our government told us. Here, I bake bread for 2,000 men every day, and they thank me for it. Not just the other prisoners, but the American soldiers too. They work beside us, eat with us, and some have become true friends. I know this sounds like fantasy, but I think I am becoming a better man in this prison than I ever was as a free soldier in Mussolini's army." The letters flowing back to Italy from Camp Hearn painted such an unexpected and positive picture that Italian families began sharing them with neighbors, friends, and relatives. Stories spread throughout southern Italy of POWs attending baseball games in small Texas towns, learning to play this strange American sport and cheering alongside local families. Tales circulated of Italian prisoners participating in town festivals, contributing their artistic skills to community projects, and even, with proper chaperonage and parental approval, developing romantic relationships with local Italian-American girls whose families had emigrated decades earlier. Giuseppe Romano's transformation was perhaps the most dramatic among all the prisoners. The horse trainer who'd arrived at Camp Hearn, broken in spirit and bitter about his capture, had become a respected and beloved figure in the local community. Red Murphy had made him an unprecedented offer, a permanent job after the war, with wages that would allow him to eventually buy his own small ranch and build a life in Texas. Giuseppe was seriously considering staying in America rather than returning to war-devastated Sicily, where his family's small farm had been destroyed in the fighting, and prospects for rebuilding seemed bleak. The camp's success as an experiment in humane prisoner treatment hadn't gone unnoticed by military authorities or the American press. Reporters from newspapers across the country visited to document this radical experiment in treating enemies like human beings. The articles they published challenged American public perceptions of what prisoner of war camps could and should be, generating both praise and criticism from readers who struggled to understand how showing kindness to enemies could be strategically valuable. One visiting journalist from the Dallas Morning News asked Major Hayes about his philosophy during a tour that showcased prisoners and guards playing volleyball together, Italian artists teaching painting techniques to American soldiers, and the camp's remarkably low rates of disciplinary problems or escape attempts. The Major, looking across the campgrounds where former enemies had become friends and collaborators, replied thoughtfully, "We figured we had two choices. We could spend our energy and resources making these men more hateful, more bitter, more determined to fight us again someday. Or we could try to make them more human, more connected to us as people rather than enemies. Seemed to us that making them more human was better for everybody, better for them, better for us, and better for whatever world we're all going to live in when this war finally ends." May, as spring turned to summer, preparations began for the eventual repatriation of prisoners who wanted to return to Italy. The process would be gradual, with prisoners departing in groups based on their home regions and family situations. But the approaching goodbyes would prove harder than anyone had expected, challenging assumptions about the temporary nature of wartime friendships and the possibility of lasting connections between former enemies. Mrs. Dorothy Jensen had become a fixture at the camp, spending entire afternoons in the art studio and developing genuine friendships with men she'd initially wanted to hate. She commissioned several paintings from Antonio, not as curiosities, but as serious artwork she displayed proudly in her home. When visitors asked about the Italian signatures on the paintings, she told them stories of the men who'd created them, challenging her neighbors' assumptions about enemies and allies. The local community had become so invested in the camp's success that several families offered to sponsor prisoners who wanted to remain in America after the war. Church groups raised funds to help prisoners send money to families in war-torn Italy. The high school art teacher began bringing students to the camp for lessons from Italian masters who shared techniques passed down through generations of European artists. If this story has moved you, leave a like. It helps Antonio's story reach more people and remember what war tried to erase, our shared humanity. But more than that, it reminds us that even in the darkest times, people can choose compassion over cruelty, understanding over hatred, and hope over despair. As summer arrived and repatriation lists were posted, the men of Camp Hearn faced choices they'd never expected to make. Some would return to Italy to rebuild their war-torn homeland. Others would choose to make new lives in Texas, becoming American citizens and raising families who would carry forward the lessons learned in this unlikely place, where enemies became friends and prisoners found freedom in the most unexpected ways. Subscribe to the channel, leave a like, and tell us in the comments which part touched you most. Because sometimes peace begins when we retell the past with empathy, and sometimes the most powerful victories happen not on battlefields, but in the quiet moments when human beings choose to see each other as people rather than enemies. Texas, summer 1975, 31 years after the war. The sun blazed over Hearn, Texas, just as it had on that October day in 1943, when a convoy of frightened Italian prisoners first rolled through the gates of what would become the most unusual POW camp in American history. But today, the gathering wasn't about captivity, it was about homecoming. Antonio Rossi, now 58 years old with silver threading through his dark hair, stood in the parking lot of what had once been Camp Hearn, now converted into a community college. His weathered hands, the same hands that had kneaded bread for thousands of men during those transformative war years, held a letter that had traveled across an ocean to reach him. It was from his nephew in Naples, confirming what Antonio had long suspected. He'd made the right choice to stay in America. Zio Antonio, the letter read, Nonna passed peacefully last month. Her final words were about you. How proud she was that you found happiness in Texas, how she understood why you couldn't return to the poverty and destruction here. She kept all your letters and the photographs of your bakery, your American wife Sarah, and your children. She said you became the man she always knew you could be. Sarah Rossi, the former Sarah Murphy, Red's daughter who'd treasured that small clay horse Giuseppe had made for her, stood beside her husband of 28 years. Their 3 children, now adults themselves, had grown up hearing stories of the Italian prisoners who'd changed their family's life forever. Their oldest son, Anthony, had become a teacher, inspired by the cross-cultural education that had flourished at the camp. Their daughter Maria worked as a translator for the State Department, her facility with languages sparked by childhood exposure to her father's Italian friends. Their youngest, Giuseppe, named for the horse trainer who'd become like a brother to Antonio, had followed his grandfather Red into ranching, but with a special focus on rehabilitating troubled horses. Giuseppe Romano had indeed stayed in Texas, taking Red Murphy's offer and building a successful horse training operation that had become legendary throughout the Southwest. At 66, he still worked with horses daily, his gentle approach now taught to a new generation of trainers who came from across the country to learn his methods. He'd married Elena Benedetto, the daughter of Italian immigrants who'd settled in nearby Bryan, and their 4 children had grown up bilingual, bicultural, and proud of their father's unique journey from prisoner to respected community leader. Red Murphy, now 78, and moving slowly but still sharp as a tack, had become something of a local historian, documenting the stories of Camp Hearn for the Robertson County Historical Society. His friendship with Giuseppe had lasted 3 decades, evolving from supervisor and prisoner to business partners to family. When people asked Red about the secret to successful prisoner rehabilitation, he'd chuckle and say, "Treat a man like an animal, and he'll act like one. Treat him like a human being, and he might just surprise you with his humanity." Major Robert Hayes had retired from the Army with the rank of colonel, but his real legacy wasn't military. It was humanitarian. He'd spent the post-war years consulting with the United Nations on prisoner treatment protocols, drawing on his Camp Hearn experience to help draft international guidelines that emphasized rehabilitation over punishment. His approach had been studied by military historians, sociologists, and peace activists around the world. Mrs. Dorothy Jensen, now 82 and still sharp-minded, had transformed her grief into purpose. She'd donated her extensive collection of Camp Hearn artwork to the Smithsonian Institution, where Antonio's murals and Giuseppe's sculptures were displayed as examples of art created under extraordinary circumstances. More importantly, she'd established a scholarship fund for children of immigrants, believing that understanding between peoples began with education and exposure to different cultures. The reunion had been organized by Danny Martinez, the former guard who'd suggested the art studio. Now a successful gallery owner in San Antonio, he'd tracked down as many camp survivors as possible, both American and Italian, for this 30th anniversary gathering. Of the 200 Italian prisoners who'd been housed at Camp Hearn, 47 had chosen to remain in the United States after the war. Most had become citizens, raised American families, and contributed to their communities in countless ways. Marco Benedetti had become a successful mechanic in Houston, specializing in European cars and training a generation of young mechanics in both technical skills and customer service. "Treat every customer's car like it belonged to your own mama," he'd tell his apprentices, echoing the respect for craftsmanship he'd learned at Camp Hearn. Silvio Martinelli had built a thriving architectural firm in Dallas, designing everything from suburban homes to public buildings. His signature style incorporated elements of both Italian Renaissance design and Texas functionality, creating structures that honored both his heritage and his adopted homeland. The Robertson County Library, which he'd designed pro bono, featured a reading room with windows positioned to capture the same quality of light he'd used in the Camp Hearn chapel. As the former prisoners and guards gathered in the community college cafeteria, built on the same ground where they'd once shared meals as captors and captives, the conversation flowed easily between English and Italian, punctuated by laughter and punctuated by tears. These men, now grandfathers and community elders, had shared an experience that transcended typical categories of friendship. They'd proven that even in wartime, human connection could overcome artificial divisions of nationality and ideology. "You know what I remember most?" Antonio said during the informal program, his English now perfect after 3 decades in Texas, though still colored by the melodic accent of his youth. "It wasn't the food, though God knows it was better than anything we'd eaten in years. It wasn't the work, though learning to be useful again saved my soul. It was the moment I realized that Sergeant Mackenzie wasn't just being kind because it was his job. He was being kind because he saw us as men, not monsters. That changed everything for me." The reunion lasted 3 days, with tours of the former campsite, visits to local families who'd hosted prisoners during the war, and emotional services at the chapel that prisoners had built and that still served the community. Local television stations covered the event, interviewing elderly residents who remembered the Italians with fondness and documenting a piece of history that challenged conventional narratives about prisoner treatment and post-war reconciliation. As the reunion concluded and the participants prepared to return to their scattered homes across Texas and beyond, they carried with them renewed appreciation for an experiment that had succeeded beyond anyone's expectations. Camp Hearn had demonstrated that treating enemies with dignity and respect could transform them into friends, that showing mercy could be more powerful than showing strength, and that the seeds of lasting peace were often planted in the most unlikely soil. The camp's legacy extended far beyond the individual stories of the men who'd lived there. It had influenced American military policy, contributed to international human rights law, and provided a model for post-conflict reconciliation that continued to inspire peacemakers around the world. More importantly, it had proven that ordinary people, farmers and bakers, cowboys and soldiers, widows and teenagers, could choose compassion over hatred, understanding over prejudice, and hope over despair. Antonio's bakery in downtown Hearn still operated under the name Romano's Italian-American Bakery, a tribute to both his heritage and his adopted homeland. The recipes he used combined techniques learned from his mother in Naples with innovations developed during his camp days, when he'd fed 2,000 men daily and learned that food prepared with love could nourish souls as well as bodies. On quiet mornings, when the first loaves were browning in the ovens and the Texas sun was just beginning to paint the eastern sky, Antonio would sometimes stand in his bakery doorway and remember that frightened young man who'd stepped off a cattle truck 32 years earlier, expecting punishment and finding instead a new life, a new family, and a new understanding of what it meant to be human. The wooden cross Red Murphy had carved for him still hung around his neck, alongside the one his mother had given him in Naples. 2 crosses, 2 countries, one man who'd learned that home wasn't necessarily where you were born, but where you were loved, respected, and given the chance to become your best self. As he'd written in his final letter to his mother before her death, "Mama, I came to Texas as a prisoner of war, but I found something here I never expected. I found myself. And in finding myself, I found home." The End Camp Hearn operated from 1942 to 1945 and housed over 4,800 prisoners of war, primarily Italian and German. It remains one of the most successful examples of humane prisoner treatment in modern military history, with remarkably low rates of disciplinary problems, escape attempts, or post-war recidivism. Many former prisoners did indeed choose to remain in the United States, becoming citizens and contributing members of their communities. Their stories remind us that even in humanity's darkest hours, we have the power to choose light over darkness, compassion over cruelty, and hope over hatred.